At 4:30 every morning, the lights flickered on at Hearth and Home Bakery in San Jose, long before the sun crept over the horizon. Among the clatter of trays and the scent of rising dough stood Isabella Torres, 31, head baker and the soul of the shop. Her hands moved with the grace of habit, shaping croissants, kneading dough, and icing cinnamon rolls that had become a neighborhood favorite. But there was something else Isabella did, something few people noticed and even fewer understood. Every day, before the morning rush, she would wrap a warm pastry in parchment, pour hot coffee into a paper cup, and step quietly out the back door. Just a block away, next to the weather-worn bus bench, she'd set them down with a small note written in careful handwriting, "Wishing you warmth and peace today." She never waited to see who picked them up. But she knew. There was an elderly man with a silver beard and a faded brown coat who sat there every morning. He never begged. He never spoke. He simply sat in silence, eyes distant, as the world hurried past him. To Isabella, he wasn't a ghost of the streets, he was a person. And people, she believed, deserved to be seen. Her co-workers whispered behind her back. "She wastes good pastries on a bum," one muttered. "She'll regret it when he starts asking for more," another warned. But Isabella didn't flinch. When a new manager suggested she donate to a shelter instead, "It's better PR," he claimed, she only nodded. The next morning, she arrived 20 minutes earlier, ensuring no one would catch her routine. She didn't care if people thought she was soft. Her fiancé, Daniel, a local firefighter, understood. "You don't just bake bread, Isa," he once told her. "You give people a reason to feel human again." For 6 years, Isabella never asked the man's name. He never offered it. Their connection was built on silent compassion, delivered daily, without judgment or expectation. But what she didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that one day, the man would break his silence and walk into her life in a way that would leave the entire city speechless. 3 months before her wedding, the atmosphere at Hearth and Home Bakery had begun to shift. New management had taken over, slick branding, tighter budgets, and a focus on customer perception. Isabella, despite her years of dedication and the loyal base of morning regulars she had built, was pulled aside during her annual review. "Your morning gestures," the manager began carefully, tapping his pen. "They're admirable, Isabella. Truly. But a few customers have mentioned feeling uncomfortable. Maybe you could support a proper organization instead." She smiled politely, said she'd consider it, and the next morning, arrived even earlier, 15 minutes before her usual time. The pastry and coffee were still left in their usual spot, the note still folded under the cup. She didn't need an audience. That was never the point. But not everyone was blind to her routine. One morning, a newly hired cashier returned from a smoke break and caught sight of Isabella slipping through the back alley. Later, he whispered to a customer loud enough for the entire room to hear, "She's been feeding that same homeless guy for years. Every single day." The customer, a well-dressed woman in her 50s, looked over at Isabella with a mix of pity and condescension. "Poor girl," she murmured. "Thinks she's changing the world with pastries." Isabella didn't say a word. She simply returned to rolling out dough, letting the words pass through her like smoke. But they lingered in the back of her mind, not because they hurt, but because they reminded her of how little people really saw each other. "You're too soft," her mother had warned her when Isabella first told her she was engaged. "You give and give. One day, you'll run out." But Isabella didn't believe kindness was a finite resource. Her fiancé, Daniel, never questioned her early departures. He had his own quiet rituals, keeping an extra pair of boots in his truck for anyone in need, dropping groceries at shelters after long shifts. "It's not about saving people," he once said. "It's about not ignoring them." Then, one rainy morning in early December, the man wasn't in his usual spot. His bench was soaked, empty, and for the first time in years, Isabella hesitated. But she still left the food, still set down the note, this time adding her own worn wool scarf. The next day, he was back. Still quiet. Still distant. But beside the empty coffee cup was something unexpected, a napkin, folded into a triangle, with faint pencil writing across its surface. The words were uneven, shaky, but unmistakable. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." She held that napkin in her hand for a long time, then folded it again and placed it in her wallet, tucked behind her driver's license where no one would ever see it. On days when the world felt harsh and rushed, she'd pull it out and read it again. The words weren't dramatic. There were no stories, no pleas for help. Just a simple truth. She had seen him, and that had been enough to matter. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that someone else had seen her, too. Someone who had once led men through fire and shrapnel, and now carried only silence and shadows. And he wasn't done with his story yet. The wedding ended, but the memory of that day never did. News of the ceremony, of the 12 Marines in full dress, of Sergeant Victor Hale walking a baker down the aisle, spread quietly at first. There were no press releases, no headlines. Just hushed conversations in firehouses and Marine reunions, whispered in tones of reverence. But for Isabella and Daniel, the world didn't change because others finally saw what she had done. It changed because she couldn't stop seeing what others ignored. They didn't return to the bakery after their honeymoon. Instead, using their wedding gift money, they rented a small storefront 2 blocks from where Victor's bench used to be. The space had peeling paint and creaky floors, but it had a large window that let the sun in, and just enough room for a few tables and a small kitchen. Above the door, they hung a wooden sign carved by a local vet. The quiet table. There were no menus, no prices, no questions asked. Anyone who came in was offered a warm breakfast, a kind word, and, if they wanted, an envelope with a handwritten note. Sometimes the notes were just reminders. You matter. You're seen. You belong. Sometimes they were quotes from Victor's napkin. One read simply, "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Victor never showed up at the quiet table. Not once. But each month, Isabella received a postcard. They arrived from every corner of the country, Utah, Texas, Pennsylvania, even a tiny fishing town in Maine. The handwriting was always the same, shaky but strong. Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you, Isabella. One card had a drawing of a folded napkin. Another had a pressed flower taped to it. And once, she received one that said only, "I'm learning to live again." Captain Duncan kept his promise, too. On the first anniversary of the quiet table's opening, he and the 11 other Marines returned, this time in civilian clothes. Each man carried a single flower, which they placed on the counter in silence. "We'll take turns volunteering," Duncan said. "This isn't an honor we intend to forget." Veterans from all over San Diego began showing up. Some stayed for hours, some only long enough to eat. No one was asked to explain where they'd been. No one was asked for a name. They were served as people, not cases, not burdens, not statistics. Just people. Isabella hung Victor's original note above the counter. Beneath it, she added her own. "Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing." Sometimes the mornings were hard. Supplies ran low. Volunteers canceled last minute. Some days it felt like they were invisible all over again. But Isabella would think of the day 12 Marines saluted her for doing what she always believed was simply right. That was always enough. Daniel, sweeping up one evening, looked over at her with a quiet smile. "When I married you," he said, "I thought I was getting a wife. Turns out, I also married a mission. And 12 Marines." She laughed. "The best kind of family, the ones who find you when you least expect it." And they kept showing up. Every week, every morning. Not because of fanfare, not for medals. But because one woman once left a pastry on a bench and didn't need to know a name to offer dignity. 6 months later, a local news crew heard whispers about a place called the Quiet Table, a breakfast service where veterans were fed with no cameras, no conditions, and no strings attached. They reached out to Isabella for an interview. She politely declined. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about the people no one sees. Let them speak if they wish." So, the crew came anyway, not with spotlights, but with notebooks. They listened to the veterans. Some shared stories. Some stayed silent. But all of them pointed to the wooden sign at the door as the reason they kept coming back. Feeding one person feeds an entire life that might otherwise be forgotten. On mornings when supplies were short, or when the bills were harder to stretch, Isabella would glance up at the framed napkin on the wall. The one that simply read, "Thank you for seeing me as a person." It was all the motivation she ever needed. Daniel never needed convincing. As a firefighter, he had seen enough to know that not all heroes wore medals. Some wore torn jackets. Some sat alone on bus benches. And some, like Victor Hale, carried the weight of the world in silence until someone simply saw them. One rainy afternoon, Isabella walked out back and found a woman sitting on the bench where it all began, soaked, shivering, and quiet. Without hesitation, she brought her inside, offered her a dry towel and a warm meal. No questions asked, because that's what Victor taught her. That we don't need to know a person's story to offer them dignity. We just need to see them. On the one-year anniversary of Isabella and Daniel's wedding, the 12 Marines returned once again. No uniforms. No speeches. Just each man carrying a single flower and placing it gently beneath the napkin frame. Captain Duncan looked around the room, his voice low but certain. We used to say, never leave a Marine behind. But Isabella, she reminded us that some people don't wear a uniform and still live by that code every day. Later that night, as Isabella closed up the quiet table, she looked out the window at the empty street and whispered to herself. Some people live as heroes, only to die in silence, if no one ever sees them as human. But not here. Not at her table. Not anymore.